What if the greatest royal love story of the modern age wasn't a love story at all? Not a tragedy, not a misunderstanding, not even a slow collapse. What if it was a plan? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That question, uncomfortable, explosive, and almost forbidden, is where this story begins. Not with shouting, not with lawyers, not with headlines screaming divorce, but with a quiet, private moment. A moment so small, it almost went unnoticed. A late night, a closed door, a set of handwritten pages that were never meant to be seen by the man whose life they would ultimately dismantle. Prince Harry didn't wake up that morning expecting his marriage to end. He woke up believing, as he had for years, that everything they had been through meant something. That sacrifice equaled loyalty. That pain equaled authenticity. That love, once hard-won, was unbreakable. But by the time that night ended, the story he had been telling himself collapsed under the weight of words written long before he ever proposed. And that's why this story matters now. Because this isn't about gossip. It isn't about sides. It isn't about who looked better in interviews or who won the media war. This is about intention, about timing, about the terrifying possibility that what one person calls destiny, another person calls strategy. Ask yourself this as we begin. If you discovered that the most important relationship of your life had an expiration date written before it even began, would you ever be the same? Harry wasn't. But to understand why, you have to go back to who he was before the marriage, before the public declarations, before the world split itself into supporters and critics, before the cameras started rolling and the interviews became confessions. Harry was a man shaped by loss. That much has never been disputed. The loss of his mother, the loss of privacy, the loss of normalcy. But what's discussed less is the emotional vacuum that followed. A longing not just for love, but for escape. For someone who didn't need the crown. Someone who didn't want the institution. Someone who saw him not as a prince, but as a man who could walk away. And when Meghan entered his life, that's exactly how it felt. She was different. That was the narrative. Independent, worldly, unafraid, unimpressed. She spoke the language of freedom at a time when Harry was desperate to hear it. She talked about choice, autonomy, purpose, about building a life on their own terms. And to Harry, that sounded like salvation. But here's the first contradiction, and it's one most people missed. You don't plan freedom if you expect permanence. You don't map exits if you believe in forever. Yet, according to the alleged materials at the center of the story, that's exactly what was happening behind the scenes. Long before the wedding, long before the engagement announcement, long before the world was told this was a fairy tale for the ages. There were journals, private ones, written not for publication, not for sympathy, not even for therapy, written to organize thoughts, to chart direction, to clarify goals. And allegedly, they weren't written by just one person. This is where the story takes its first dark turn. Because the diaries, as they are described by sources close to the situation, weren't emotional ramblings about love or uncertainty. They read more like blueprints, timelines, strategic reflections, notes about optics, about leverage, about what could be gained and when. And if that sounds cold, pause for a moment and ask yourself, how many life-altering decisions are actually made emotionally? And how many are made pragmatically but disguised as destiny? The public version of the relationship was intoxicating. A prince falling for a woman outside the system. A modern love challenging an ancient institution. It had heroes, villains, obstacles, triumph. The kind of story people wanted to believe in. But behind that story, another one may have been quietly unfolding. One that didn't begin with love, but with opportunity. Now, it's important to be clear about something. This narrative does not claim absolute fact. It reconstructs an alleged sequence of events based on rumored documents, whispered confirmations, and patterns that only became visible in hindsight. It is an examination of intention, not a courtroom verdict. But intention is powerful. And when intention is documented, it becomes impossible to ignore. According to those familiar with the contents of the diaries, there were recurring themes. Fame, influence, independence, exit. Not framed as betrayal, but as inevitability. As if the relationship itself was a means to an end, not the end itself. And here's the part that reportedly stunned Harry the most, the timeline. The earliest entries were not written after tensions with the royal family began. They weren't written during moments of conflict or media pressure. They weren't written after the move away from royal duties. They were written at the beginning, before the wedding dress, before the vows, before the world was told this was love conquering tradition. That's the kind of realization that doesn't just hurt. It reorders your entire memory. Every conversation, every reassurance, every moment you thought was spontaneous suddenly feels rehearsed. Imagine rereading your life and realizing you were the only one improvising. For Harry, the emotional whiplash was devastating because he hadn't just married a woman, he had dismantled his entire world for her. He had fractured relationships, burned bridges, and publicly challenged the institution that raised him. He had chosen her again and again, often at great personal cost. And yet, if the diaries are to be believed, the outcome may have already been decided. This is where the role of Meghan's mother enters the story, not as a villain, but as an influence, a voice in the margins, a sounding board, a collaborator in thought. The diaries reportedly show not just individual reflection, but shared strategy. Conversations turned into written confirmation, maternal guidance blending into long-term planning. Is that unusual? Not necessarily. Parents advise their children all the time, especially when power, wealth, and exposure are involved. But the line between guidance and orchestration can become dangerously thin when ambition enters the room. And according to this narrative, ambition was always present. There were notes about branding, about narrative control, about how public sympathy could be leveraged, about how victimhood could be framed, about how departure would look, not if it happened, but when. That's the word that keeps resurfacing. When. Not maybe. Not unless. When. For Harry, discovering this wasn't like catching someone in a lie. It was worse. It was discovering that the truth he had lived inside was never shared by the person he trusted most. And yet, he didn't explode. He didn't storm out. He didn't leak the pages. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he did something far more human. He froze. Because when your reality shatters quietly, your first instinct isn't anger, it's denial. You tell yourself there must be context you're missing, that words written privately don't reflect intention, that plans change, that love evolves. You cling to the version of the story that hurts the least. But doubt, once planted, doesn't stay small. It grows in silence, in glances, in pauses between conversations, in moments that no longer feel safe. Harry began replaying memories, not to savor them, but to interrogate them. He questioned motives he had never doubted, reinterpreted arguments he had once blamed on stress, noticed patterns that had always been there, hiding in plain sight. And slowly, painfully, another realization emerged. This wasn't about money alone. It wasn't about titles. It wasn't even about fame. It was about control. Control over narrative, over timing, over departure, over how the story would end, and who would be blamed when it did. That realization changes everything, because when one person believes they are building a life, and the other is preparing an exit, the relationship is already over, even if no one has said it out loud. So why did it take so long? Why didn't the marriage collapse sooner? Why did Harry stay, even after doubt crept in? Those answers don't live in the diaries. They live in Harry himself, in his loyalty, in his fear of repeating history, in his desperation not to fail at love the way he believed others had failed him. And that's what makes what comes next so devastating, because the diaries were only the beginning. There was one entry, reportedly brief, almost casual, that shattered the last illusion Harry was holding on to. An entry that didn't talk about escape or strategy or media. It talked about him, not as a partner, not as a husband, but as a phase. And once Harry read that line, everything changed. He didn't confront her that night. He didn't sleep. He sat with the knowledge that the marriage he fought for may have been temporary by design, and the next decision he made would alter the rest of his life. But what he did next, and how he confirmed that the diary wasn't just private fantasy, would turn suspicion into certainty, because someone else knew about the plan. And they didn't stay silent. Someone else knew about the plan. That was the thought that refused to leave Harry's mind as dawn crept through the windows that morning. It wasn't just the diary. It wasn't just the words on the page. It was the realization that secrets like that rarely live in isolation. Plans don't stay confined to notebooks forever. They leak through conversations, through assumptions, through confidence shared with the wrong or right people. And if someone else knew, then this wasn't imagination. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't grief talking. It was real. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to confront. Betrayals rarely arrive as explosions. They arrive as confirmations, as small moments that click into place and suddenly make everything before them impossible to unsee. For Harry, that confirmation didn't come from confrontation. It came from memory. He began replaying the early days of the relationship, not with nostalgia, but with forensic precision. Every conversation, every reassurance, every time he'd been told, "I don't care about titles," or "I never wanted this life," or "I just want you." At the time, those words had felt like oxygen, like proof that he was finally loved for who he was, not what he represented. Now, they sounded different. Now, they sounded like positioning. Ask yourself something honestly. How often do we fall in love with how someone sees us rather than who they are? And how dangerous is that when the person looking back already knows where they're going? Harry had always believed he was the exception. The prince who found someone untouched by the institution. The man who inspired a woman to reject fame instead of chase it. The one whose love story would rewrite the rules. Oh, that belief wasn't arrogance, it was hope. And hope makes people blind. From the very beginning, the relationship moved fast. Not just emotionally, but structurally. Conversations about the future happened early. About escape. About building a life away from the palace. About independence. About telling their own story. Harry thought that meant commitment. What he didn't consider was that someone talking about leaving before they've even arrived might not be dreaming. They might be planning. There's a difference between wanting out and never intending to stay. But here's the part that complicates everything. Harry wasn't coerced. He wasn't manipulated in a way that felt aggressive or obvious. No ultimatums, no threats, no dramatic demands. Instead, he was encouraged. Encouraged to believe he was rescuing someone from a system she never wanted. Encouraged to see himself as the brave one, the protector, the man who chose love over legacy. That's a powerful role to inhabit. And once you accept that role, you start making decisions to live up to it. You defend harder. You isolate more. You justify what others question. Harry defended the relationship against friends, family, advisors, and the press. Every warning sounded like jealousy or cruelty to him. Every concern felt like an attack on the woman he loved. He didn't see red flags. He saw enemies, and that's exactly how loyalty becomes a liability. The irony is brutal. The very qualities that made Harry devoted, his empathy, his protectiveness, his refusal to abandon someone under pressure, were the same qualities that made him vulnerable to someone who already knew how the story could end. According to accounts tied to the diary, there was an assumption baked into the plan that Harry would follow, that his resentment toward the institution, his unresolved grief, and his desire for autonomy would make him predictable. Not weak, predictable. That distinction matters. Harry wasn't a fool. He was a man searching for meaning outside the shadow of his past, and when someone offered him a version of the future where he was free, admired, and morally justified, he stepped into it willingly. But freedom framed as love can become a cage of expectation. The diaries allegedly reflected that understanding. They didn't describe Harry as disposable, but they didn't describe him as permanent either. He was part of the arc, a necessary chapter, a bridge between obscurity and global relevance. And bridges aren't destinations. That realization cut deeper than any insult ever could. Harry began to understand something terrifying, that being chosen didn't mean being irreplaceable. It meant being useful. Once that thought took root, it spread everywhere. He remembered moments that had felt off at the time but had been brushed aside. Decisions that prioritized optics over intimacy, conflicts that escalated when the narrative wasn't fully controlled. An unusual comfort with controversy, as long as it produced attention. Attention is currency, and those who know how to spend it don't waste it on accidents. Harry asked himself a question he had avoided for years. If the goal was always independence, why did it require maximum exposure first? Why did privacy only matter after visibility had been secured? Those aren't questions born of bitterness, they're questions born of clarity. And clarity is unforgiving. As Harry processed this, Another memory resurfaced, one he hadn't connected to anything until now. A casual comment overheard in passing, not said to him, but around him. A remark about timing, about waiting, about how things would look later. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it meant everything, because it implied foresight, and foresight implies intention. This is where the presence of the mother became impossible to ignore. Not as a caricature, not as a mastermind, but as a participant in conversation. Someone who understood power dynamics. Someone who had lived enough life to know that opportunity doesn't knock forever. The diaries reportedly reflected alignment, not constant plotting, but agreement, reinforcement, validation, the kind that turns a thought into a plan. When family supports your vision, it becomes harder to question it. And when your partner believes that support is unconditional love, the imbalance grows. Harry began to realize that he had been reacting to a script he never read. Every time he fought publicly, it advanced the narrative. Every time he withdrew from his family, it strengthened the divide. Every time he spoke about pain, it positioned him exactly where the story needed him. That's a horrifying realization for anyone, but especially for someone who spent his life trying to escape being controlled. Because it means the rebellion wasn't rebellion at all. It was anticipated. Here's the contradiction that still haunts this chapter of the story. Harry wasn't wrong to want out. He wasn't wrong to question the institution. He wasn't wrong to prioritize mental health, boundaries, or love. What shattered him was discovering that his personal awakening may have been used as leverage in someone else's long-term design. Two truths can coexist, and that's what makes this so complicated. Harry didn't suddenly hate Meghan. He didn't become cold overnight. What he felt was worse. Disorientation. The kind that makes you doubt your own judgment. The kind that asks, if I was wrong about this, what else was I wrong about? The kind that forces you to question whether love can ever be separated from outcome. And yet, even then, he didn't leave. That's the part critics never understand. Why didn't he walk away the moment he saw the diary? Because walking away would have meant accepting that everything he sacrificed, family ties, public standing, personal identity, had been built on a misunderstanding. And that's a grief most people aren't ready to face immediately. Instead, Harry watched, he listened, he waited. And that waiting revealed something even more damning. The behavior didn't change. The forward momentum toward independence continued. The framing of events remained calculated. The emphasis on narrative control intensified rather than softened. If the diary had been outdated fantasy, reality would have contradicted it. It didn't. It confirmed it. Harry began to see that the marriage itself had become a stage, a place where roles mattered more than connection, where conflict could be repurposed, where pain had utility. And slowly, the man who thought he had been chosen began to understand that choice had never been mutual. That understanding didn't turn him into an enemy, it turned him inward. Because once you realize you were part of a plan, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when the plan is complete? That question terrified him, because if departure had always been the destination, then love was never the anchor, it was the vehicle. And vehicles are abandoned when they've taken you far enough. Harry knew then that he couldn't confront this with anger. He needed proof beyond his own interpretation, something external, something undeniable, someone else who could confirm that the diary wasn't just private reflection. And that's when the silence broke, because the person who knew about the plan didn't come forward out of loyalty. They came forward out of fear. And what they told Harry didn't just validate his doubts, it reframed the entire beginning of the relationship in a way he could no longer ignore. Because the plan hadn't started when he thought, it started before they ever met. And once Harry learned how early the groundwork had been laid, he realized something chilling. He hadn't fallen into a love story, he had walked into a trajectory. And what came next would force him to decide whether staying silent was protecting love or betraying himself. What if the most powerful part of the story wasn't the relationship, but the image of it? That was the question that kept circling Harry's mind after the silence finally broke. After the confirmation arrived, after the quiet understanding that the diary wasn't an isolated artifact of private thought, but part of a broader awareness shared beyond its pages. Because once someone else acknowledged the plan, the next realization followed fast and hard. The public image hadn't merely accompanied the relationship. It had driven it. Harry had always believed the image came second, that the love existed first and the cameras followed, that the narrative grew organically out of genuine emotion, that the world was watching something real unfold in real time. Now, he began to suspect the opposite, that the image had been constructed early, that the narrative had been rehearsed, that the world wasn't watching love happen, it was watching love being framed. Think about how most people fall in love. It's messy, awkward, inconsistent, private. The public usually sees the polished version later, after time has done its work. But this story arrived polished from the start. From the first official appearances, the symbolism was impeccable. The clothing choices, the body language, the contrasts, the optics of modernity against tradition. Every moment seemed designed to communicate a message louder than the moment itself. Harry hadn't noticed, because he was inside it. When you're inside something, you feel it emotionally, not analytically. You assume intention is mutual. You assume vulnerability equals sincerity, but image doesn't require sincerity. It requires consistency. And consistency, Harry would come to realize, had been there long before intimacy fully developed. The woman the world met was presented as an antidote to the monarchy's stiffness. Warm, progressive, unafraid to challenge norms, a symbol of evolution. A visible statement that the institution could change, or at least be challenged. That image mattered. It wasn't accidental. It resonated deeply with global audiences hungry for disruption and reform. It positioned the relationship not just as romance, but as movement. And movements generate power. Harry had been proud of that. Proud to stand beside someone who represented progress. Proud to feel like his love story meant something beyond tabloids and gossip. But what he didn't consider was this: movements don't belong to individuals, they belong to narratives. And narratives are shaped. The more Harry examined early footage, early coverage, early reactions, the more he saw something unsettling. The moments that drew the most attention weren't spontaneous affection or private connection. They were moments that reinforced the story being sold. The outsider challenging tradition, the prince choosing love over duty, the woman unafraid to walk away. Walk away. That phrase echoed now, because walking away had been framed as a virtue long before it became reality. There were interviews that emphasized autonomy, statements about independence, repeated references to not needing the institution. These weren't reactions to pressure. They were declarations of identity. Harry began asking himself something that hurt more than any accusation. Was the relationship serving the image, or was the image serving the relationship? And if the answer was the former, then love had become a tool, not the foundation. This is where contradiction becomes unavoidable, because Harry genuinely loved her. He felt it. He lived it. He sacrificed for it. That love was real to him. But real love does not automatically mean mutual intention. Someone can love what you provide without loving who you are once you no longer serve that purpose. And that's where image becomes dangerous, because image rewards performance. It doesn't require permanence. The more successful the image became, the more entrenched the narrative grew. Public sympathy, media protection, cultural alignment, all of it reinforced the idea that this story had moral weight, and moral weight makes criticism feel cruel. Harry had mistaken that protection for love. He now understood it as insulation. The insulation allowed distance to grow behind the scenes. It allowed tension to be reframed as persecution. It allowed any internal conflict to be externalized and blamed on outside forces. That dynamic is intoxicating when you're inside it. It creates a world where doubt feels like betrayal and loyalty feels like virtue. Harry had lived in that world for years, until the diary cracked it open. According to what he was told, the image had been discussed explicitly, not in a sinister way. Not in language that screamed manipulation, but in the calm, rational tone of people who understand media, which is perhaps the most chilling part. There was no malice. There was calculation. What looks better? What lands emotionally? What builds leverage? Those questions don't sound evil on their own. They sound professional, strategic, smart. But when they apply to marriage, the implications change. Marriage is supposed to be the one space where you don't perform, where you don't optimize, where you don't brand. Yet Harry began to see that even private moments were filtered through future optics. Arguments weren't just arguments, they were potential talking points. Pain wasn't just pain, it was narrative capital. And that realization reframed everything. Why certain fights escalated when cameras were near. Why reconciliation often followed exposure. Why silence felt temporary but attention felt constant. Image thrives on tension. Love does not. Harry remembered times when he had wanted to slow down, to pull inward, to protect something just for themselves. Those moments were often met with resistance, framed as fear or weakness or capitulation to an institution that didn't deserve loyalty. He had accepted that framing without question. Now he wondered, was privacy a threat because it weakened the narrative? If the image faded, what remained? That question terrified him. Because the more he interrogated it, the more he realized how much of his identity had become entangled with the story, not just as a husband, but as a symbol, as proof that escape was possible, that rebellion could succeed. Symbols don't retire easily, and those who manage symbols don't let go without a plan. Harry began to see how departure had been framed long before departure occurred, how independence had been marketed as inevitable, how every step away from the institution strengthened the image rather than destabilized it. Even conflict fed it. That's when the confirmation he received took on deeper meaning. The person who spoke to him didn't just acknowledge the diary. They acknowledged discussions, conversations that treated the relationship as a vehicle for transformation. Transformation of status, of platform, of relevance. The word relevance landed heavily, because relevance has a shelf life. It must be renewed, maintained, escalated. And once the relationship had served its purpose publicly, the next act had to be compelling enough to stand on its own. That's when Harry understood the real danger of image-driven love. It doesn't end quietly. It ends with a story, and stories require endings that make sense to the audience. Harry wasn't afraid of divorce at that point. He was afraid of becoming the villain in a narrative he helped create. That fear kept him quiet longer than he should have been. It kept him compliant when his instincts told him to pull back. It kept him hoping that love might still override momentum. But image momentum doesn't slow down for hope. It accelerates. Harry began noticing shifts in tone. Subtle, but significant. Language that emphasized self over partnership. Statements that centered struggle but not reconciliation. Planning that didn't include him beyond a certain horizon. He asked himself the question no one wants to ask while still married. If I disappeared from this picture tomorrow, would the story continue? The answer, he realized, was yes. And that realization was devastating, because it meant the image had outgrown the marriage. When image becomes larger than intimacy, intimacy suffocates. Harry felt that suffocation in small ways at first. A sense of being managed rather than known. A growing distance between private emotion and public presentation. A quiet understanding that vulnerability was acceptable only if it aligned with narrative needs. He began pulling inward, not out of spite, but self-preservation. And that withdrawal was noticed, not with panic, with recalibration. The image adjusted. And that told him everything he needed to know. Because when love falters, people fight for connection. When image falters, people protect positioning. Harry saw the protection kick in, and once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The dream he thought he had entered, the one where love broke the rules, revealed itself as something far more calculated. A dream can still feel real while it's happening. That doesn't make it permanent. Harry understood then that the image had been sold brilliantly, just not to him. He had been the last audience to realize what the story required. And as he wrestled with that truth, another contradiction emerged, one that made his decision unavoidable. Because the image needed him, until it didn't. And the moment he stopped playing his part instinctively, the story began preparing for a different ending, one where independence looked heroic and marriage looked optional. That's when Harry knew he had reached a crossroads. Stay inside the image and disappear as a person. Or step out of it and reclaim himself, no matter the cost. But before he could make that choice, something happened that confirmed the image was already shifting. The narrative had begun to move without him. And once he realized that, he knew the next chapter wouldn't be written by both of them. It would be written about him. What if the most dangerous secret isn't what's said out loud, but what's written down when no one is watching? That question hung over Harry like a low cloud as the image he once trusted began to unravel. Because images can be explained away, narratives can be reframed. Public moments can be misinterpreted. But handwriting? Handwriting is intimate. It's slow. It requires intention. You don't accidentally write a future you don't expect to live. The diary wasn't dramatic. That was the first thing that unsettled him. No grand declarations, no obvious malice, no villain monologues, just calm entries, measured reflections. Harry hadn't been snooping. That's another uncomfortable truth. The pages weren't discovered through betrayal or suspicion. They surfaced through circumstance, a moment of trust, a lapse in privacy, a situation no one anticipated would collide with consequence. And once he saw them, he couldn't pretend he hadn't. The first entry he read didn't even mention him by name. It referenced a direction, a feeling of inevitability, a sense that the path ahead was already forming, even if the details weren't finalized yet. But what shook him wasn't what it said, it was how early it was written. Before the world knew, before the engagement rumors, before the life-altering commitments, Harry sat there trying to rationalize it. People journal all the time. People write possibilities they never pursue. Writing doesn't equal intent. But then he kept reading. And patterns emerged. Repeated references to independence, to exit, to how things would eventually need to shift, to how staying too long could limit opportunity, to how being inside something powerful was different from belonging to it. Those are not the words of someone imagining permanence. Those are the words of someone timing their departure. As Harry turned the pages, the emotional weight didn't hit him all at once. It came in waves. Each entry recontextualized the last. Each note cast a shadow over memories he had cherished. He remembered moments when she had spoken passionately about freedom, about not wanting to be trapped, about how she admired people who knew when to walk away. At the time, he had admired that strength. Now, he wondered if he had mistaken preparation for principle. The most unsettling part wasn't the content itself. It was the confidence behind it. There was no anxiety in the writing, no hesitation, no fear of loss, just a quiet certainty that change was not only coming, but necessary. Necessary for what? That question burned. Then came the entries that referenced conversations, not arguments, conversations, exchanges of thought, reflections shaped by discussion, ideas tested and refined. And that's when Harry understood this diary hadn't been written in isolation. There was a second voice in the margins, not always explicitly, sometimes through phrasing, sometimes through agreement, sometimes through the calm reinforcement that appears when someone feels validated by another person they trust. The presence of a maternal influence wasn't shocking on its own. Parents talk to their children, they advise, they warn, they dream on their behalf. But this wasn't cautionary guidance. This was alignment. The diary didn't frame the relationship as uncertain or risky. It framed it as transitional, as a necessary phase in a longer journey, a means of elevation, a way in. Harry found himself rereading certain lines over and over, hoping they would soften with repetition. They didn't. One entry stood out in particular. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. It was almost mundane. It talked about how people rarely see transitions clearly when they're inside them, how proximity to power creates both opportunity and limitation, how staying too long can turn momentum into stagnation. Harry stared at that line for a long time, because stagnation wasn't a word he had ever associated with marriage. Marriage was supposed to be grounding, anchoring, stabilizing, not limiting. The diary framed the royal world not as a home, but as a platform, a stage, something to step onto and eventually step away from with maximum visibility. Visibility. That word appeared again and again. Visibility before autonomy. Recognition before reinvention. Story before silence. Harry felt his chest tighten as he realized something else. There was no entry about staying. No exploration of how to make it work long term. No curiosity about compromise. No grappling with what permanence would require emotionally. The diary assumed departure, not with bitterness, with acceptance. And acceptance is far more dangerous than anger, because anger can be resolved. Acceptance is final. Harry's mind raced as he tried to reconcile this with the woman he thought he knew, the woman who cried in private, who expressed pain, who spoke of isolation and misunderstanding. Those emotions may have been real. People can feel pain even while pursuing self-interest. But pain doesn't negate intention. It can coexist with it. This is where Harry felt the deepest betrayal, not because of ambition, but because of asymmetry. He had been willing to burn his life down for love. She had been willing to move on once the timing was right. Those are not equal risks. Harry realized then that love hadn't failed him. Expectation had. He had expected mutual vulnerability, mutual sacrifice, mutual uncertainty. What he found instead was foresight. And foresight shifts power, because the person who sees the end first controls the pace of the beginning. The diary wasn't cruel. That's what made it devastating. It was pragmatic, strategic, almost gentle in its certainty. It didn't demonize Harry, it minimized him. And minimization is its own kind of erasure. He found an entry that spoke about legacy, not in the royal sense, in the personal brand sense, about ensuring that whatever came next would stand independently, about not being defined by one chapter forever. Harry had wanted that too, but together. The difference was subtle but fatal. He wanted a shared future. The diary described sequential futures, first this, then that, and when one chapter closes, another begins. Harry realized he wasn't afraid of being left. He was afraid of having been temporary. That's a pain that doesn't scream, it sinks. As he read on, something else became clear. The diary had evolved. Early entries were more exploratory, later ones more confident. As the relationship progressed, the certainty hardened rather than softened. Love usually does the opposite. Love introduces doubt, not eradicates it. The closer they got, the more the plan crystallized. That told Harry something he didn't want to know. The relationship hadn't changed the trajectory. It had confirmed it. And then he reached the entry that stopped him cold. It was brief, almost throwaway, a line that could easily be dismissed by anyone skimming. It referred to how certain relationships are catalyst, necessary, transformative, but not enduring. How some people are meant to walk with you only until you reach the place where you can walk alone. Harry knew in that moment who that line was about. It wasn't cruel. It was efficient. He closed the diary and sat in silence, feeling something he had never felt before in his life. Not anger, not sadness, but displacement. The sense that he had been living inside someone else's timeline without knowing it. He didn't confront her immediately because he needed to know one thing first. Was this diary private fantasy or shared expectation? That's when he reached out quietly, carefully, not accusing, not emotional, just searching for confirmation. And confirmation came not from the source he expected, from someone who had been present earlier than Harry realized, someone who had heard discussions before the relationship became official, someone who had been told casually, confidently, that the future would unfold a certain way. That person didn't speak out of malice. They spoke because they believed Harry already knew. That assumption told him everything. Because you don't assume knowledge unless something has been discussed openly. And once Harry understood that, the diary stopped being a document. It became evidence. Evidence not of wrongdoing, but of misalignment so deep it made the marriage unsalvageable. Harry understood then that confronting her wouldn't change the truth. It would only change the timing, and timing, he now realized, had always been the point. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't cry. He sat with the quiet devastation of knowing that love, no matter how sincere on one side, cannot survive when the other side has already moved on in their mind. And as dawn approached, Harry made a decision, not about divorce, not yet, but about observation. He would stop reacting. He would stop defending. He would watch, because the diary had shown him the plan. Now he needed to see how close it was to completion, and what he noticed next would confirm that the ending had already begun. What happens when guidance becomes direction, and direction becomes destiny? Harry didn't ask that question out loud at first. He let it sit quietly in his mind, heavy and unresolved, as he began doing the one thing he had never done before in his marriage. He stopped explaining. No defending. No justifying. No emotional firefighting. He watched. Because once you suspect a plan exists, the most revealing thing you can do is step out of the way and see how it continues without your input. And what Harry began to notice was subtle, but devastating in its consistency. The influence he had once dismissed as background noise suddenly moved into focus. Her mother had always been present, but not intrusive, supportive, but calm. The kind of presence that feels grounding rather than controlling. Harry had respected that, even welcomed it. After everything he'd been through, the idea of family unity felt comforting. But comfort can hide alignment. And alignment, once seen, cannot be unseen. It started with language, not commands, not pressure, but reinforcement. Phrases repeated in different forms. Ideas echoed back with quiet confidence. The kind of agreement that doesn't argue, it affirms. You're right to feel this way. You deserve more. This situation was never sustainable. Harry realized he had been hearing versions of the same message for years, always framed as concern, never as instruction, but concern shapes decisions just as effectively as orders, especially when it comes from someone positioned as wisdom. He began to connect the diary entries to real conversations, moments he had been present for but hadn't registered as significant at the time. Discussions about timing, about endurance, about not staying in places that drain you, all reasonable sentiments on their own until they start pointing in one direction. Harry wasn't naive enough to believe parents don't influence major life choices. Of course they do. But what unsettled him was the degree of coherence between the diary and the external reinforcement. This wasn't scattered advice, it was synchronized thinking. The diary didn't read like someone wrestling with doubt while being comforted by a parent. It read like someone receiving validation for a path they had already chosen. And validation is powerful. Validation removes friction. It turns internal hesitation into confidence. It transforms uncertainty into inevitability. Harry began to see how that validation may have shaped decisions long before he ever realized there was a choice to be made. The earliest entries didn't speak of struggle with staying. They spoke of managing transition, of how to endure a phase without losing momentum, of how to make sure the exit felt justified. That kind of thinking doesn't arise in a vacuum. It arises when someone believes the destination matters more than the process. Harry remembered how often conversations about the future happened without him in the room. Not secretively, just naturally. Mother and daughter talking, processing, planning, dreaming. At the time, he had felt relieved. Less pressure, less conflict. Now, he wondered if those conversations had already answered questions he thought were still open. Because when two people agree on an outcome, the third person often becomes a variable, not a partner. Harry didn't feel hated. He felt accounted for. That distinction hurt in a way he didn't have language for yet. There was no sense of hostility, no animosity, just a quiet assumption that he would adapt, that he would follow, that he would understand. And for a long time, he had. That's what frightened him the most. He began to see how his own values had been gently reframed, how his desire for autonomy had been encouraged in ways that aligned perfectly with a pre-existing trajectory. He thought he was choosing freedom. He was stepping into it at the exact moment it was needed. That doesn't mean the feelings weren't real. They likely were. Humans are complex. We can love sincerely while still pursuing outcomes that benefit us. But love that depends on timing rather than commitment is fragile. Harry realized that the maternal presence in this story wasn't about control. It was about continuity. The diary reflected it clearly. When one voice wavered, another steadied it. When doubt surfaced, it was contextualized, rationalized, framed as temporary discomfort on the way to something better. Better is a dangerous word. Because better for whom? Harry began noticing how often he was described not as a partner, but as a situation, a circumstance, a chapter that required endurance rather than investment. That's when the emotional shift happened. Not rage, not despair, distance. Harry began pulling back emotionally, without announcing it, without accusation, without explanation. He needed to know whether his presence was essential or simply assumed. And the response to that withdrawal told him everything. There was no panic, no reaching, no fear. Instead, there was recalibration. Plans continued. Messaging continued. Momentum didn't stall. That's when Harry realized the most painful truth of all. He wasn't being held. He was being accommodated. Accommodation doesn't require intimacy. It requires convenience. And once convenience shifts, so does attachment. The maternal influence became more visible then, not louder, just more central. More meetings, more strategy, more reassurance that everything was unfolding as it should. Harry noticed how often future scenarios were discussed without reference to partnership. Independence was framed as personal achievement, not shared success. That's when he finally asked himself the question he had avoided for years. If love was the foundation, why did the future never require us both equally? He thought back to moments when he had expressed doubt. Moments when he had questioned pace, exposure, escalation. Those doubts had always been met with calm reassurance. Don't worry, this is temporary. Everything will make sense later. Later. The diary used that word too. Later, as a destination, not a shared horizon. Harry began to feel like a guest in his own marriage. Involved, but not consulted. Present, but not central. And still, he didn't confront anyone, because confrontation would only reveal one thing: whether this alignment would fracture under pressure. And Harry wasn't ready to see that yet. Instead, he waited. And waiting revealed something even more telling. The mother's role wasn't defensive. It was preparatory. There were conversations about resilience, about public perception, about standing strong in the face of criticism, about how people always misunderstand powerful women who choose themselves. Again, none of this is inherently wrong, but it becomes something else when it's paired with a pre-written exit, because resilience in that context isn't about staying, it's about surviving the fallout. Harry realized that the narrative had already accounted for opposition, for backlash, for blame. He wondered quietly whether it had also accounted for him, not as a partner, but as a character. That thought unsettled him deeply. He had spent his life being written about, talked about, analyzed by strangers. Marriage was supposed to be the one place where he wasn't a role. But here he was again. A symbol, a phase, a stepping stone. The diary's margins suddenly felt louder than the words themselves, because margins are where influence lives. Not in the main text, but in what's reinforced, underlined, returned to again and again. Harry realized he had underestimated the power of agreement, how dangerous it is when two people agree on an outcome while the third believes the outcome is still being negotiated. He wasn't angry at the mother. He was afraid of the alignment. Because alignment means the plan doesn't depend on one person's feelings, it depends on consensus. And once consensus exists, dissent becomes irrelevant. Harry understood then why he had felt increasingly unnecessary in conversations about the future. Why reassurance replaced discussion. Why decisions felt pre-made. The marriage hadn't failed emotionally yet, but structurally, it had already moved on. Harry didn't confront the mother either. That wasn't his battle. His battle was internal. He needed to decide whether he was willing to stay in a relationship where the end was already agreed upon, even if the timing was still flexible. And that's when the diary delivered its final blow. An entry that referenced patience. Not patience for healing. Patience for opportunity. Waiting until the moment would feel justified. Waiting until departure could be framed as empowerment rather than abandonment. Harry closed the diary and felt something shift permanently inside him. Because empowerment that requires someone else to be collateral is not empowerment. It's extraction. And once you see yourself as a resource being extracted, love can no longer survive. Harry realized then that the maternal influence wasn't about protecting a daughter from harm, it was about protecting a trajectory from derailment. And Harry, with his doubts, his slowing pace, his emotional hesitation, had become a potential derailment. That understanding changed how he saw every interaction that followed. The calm reassurance wasn't for him. It was for continuity. And continuity doesn't require marriage. It requires momentum. Harry knew then that the decision he feared was already being made around him. He could stay and become irrelevant, or he could step out before the narrative did it for him. But before he acted, one final contradiction surfaced, one that forced his hand. Because despite all the planning, despite all the alignment, there was one thing no one had anticipated. Harry had stopped playing his part, and the system noticed. What happened next exposed just how little the marriage itself mattered compared to the story it was meant to serve. You ever wonder how early someone can plan to leave a marriage before it even starts? Harry did. And now, staring at the diaries, he realized the answer was long before he ever walked down the aisle. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a reaction to public pressure. It wasn't a coping mechanism for media scrutiny. The plan had existed, clear, methodical, deliberate, before any engagement, before rings, before cameras, before love had a chance to breathe. And that's what made it devastating. Harry had believed the relationship was unfolding naturally, that every compromise, every late-night conversation, every shared laugh had been mutual discovery. Every plan they had built together was, to him, a step toward a shared future. But according to the diary, the shared future wasn't shared at all. The entries weren't emotional confessions. They were strategic outlines. Notes about timing, leverage, narrative, and visibility. Words that could have been bullet points in a business presentation. Phase 1, build trust. Phase 2, establish independence. Phase 3, ensure media narrative aligns with exit. And the timing was precise. Not a day was wasted. Not a moment unplanned. Every argument, every reconciliation, every public display of affection was, allegedly, part of a trajectory that Harry wasn't aware existed. He read one entry where she detailed how the royal family could be leveraged for visibility, not disrespectfully, not maliciously, just analytically. She had understood the optics, the public appetite for a rebellious love story, and she had mapped how to harness it. Every smile, every gesture, every subtle contrast against tradition had a purpose. Harry felt sick. He remembered those moments fondly, her laughing at a royal dinner, holding his hand at public events, the whispered assurances in private. He had believed every one of those moments meant the same thing to her that it did to him. Connection, love, intimacy. Now he wondered, had he been performing on someone else's stage the entire time without realizing it? And then came the entries about departure. They weren't written as emotional reaction to anything. They weren't, I might leave if. They were, I will leave when, and described in clinical, clear terms. The diary had a cadence, a rhythm, a certainty. It wasn't about possibility. It was about execution. Harry's stomach tightened as he read the next section. It described sequences of life events, almost like a to-do list. Engagement confirmed. Secure public favor. Align narrative with media outlets. Ensure independent platform is stable. Prepare step away from the institution. Exit timed for maximum attention and autonomy. He read it again, convinced he had misinterpreted it, but there it was, clear, typed in her hand, or at least precise, structured handwriting. It mapped a route he hadn't even imagined existed. He realized she hadn't married for love alone. She had married for opportunity, for platform, for leverage, and Harry, deeply in love, trusting, loyal, was the most significant piece of that plan. The diary wasn't cruel. It wasn't vindictive. It was pragmatic, strategic, efficient. And efficient is far worse than cruel, because cruel gives you the chance to react. Efficiency leaves no room for negotiation. He closed the diary for a moment, trying to breathe. His mind went back to their first real conversation about marriage. How she had spoken passionately about autonomy, partnership, independence. He remembered feeling seen, understood, loved. And now he wondered how much of that was genuine feeling and how much was rehearsal, how much was placement, how much was the scaffolding of a pre-planned trajectory. The shock was immediate, but the revelation was gradual. He began mapping the timeline in his head. Dates, milestones, decisions he had made that had unknowingly aligned with the exit plan rather than the relationship. Public appearances, charity launches, media interviews, private commitments. Every moment now seemed to serve two masters, love for him and strategic visibility for her, and the narrative she and her mother had built. He remembered the early warnings he had heard from friends, family, advisors, small comments about pace, about media control, about how quick everything had moved. At the time, he dismissed them as jealousy, misunderstanding, or interference. Now, he saw them as prescient, as observations he had refused to accept. There was no one to blame but himself for ignoring them, and yet, part of him still refused to hate her, because love had been real. Moments had been real. Laughter, intimacy, connection, they were tangible, irreplaceable, unmanufactured. But even reality can exist within someone else's plan. Harry realized the most horrifying element of all. He hadn't been protected by love. He had been essential to it. He had been a participant in an operation disguised as romance. And just like any operation, once the objectives were met, the key players became expendable. He remembered reading that line in the diary again, the words describing relationships as catalysts, necessary, transformative, not permanent. Those words echoed in his mind. He thought of their wedding, of how every moment had been choreographed, carefully curated to generate public sympathy, admiration, and attention. Every smile, every gesture, every look had been documented, analyzed, shared. And Harry realized now that it had been planned from the beginning. The love story the world adored had a backstory he hadn't even been allowed to see until now. He wondered, had she ever intended to stay at all? The thought was unbearable. And then he remembered the subtle messages embedded in the diary, notes on timing, on sequencing, on how to leave gracefully without losing face, how to maximize independence, how to ensure public perception painted the exit as empowerment, not abandonment. It was all there, written years before he even met her. Harry felt a dizzying mix of betrayal and awe. It was meticulous, brilliant, cruel in its precision, and it was undeniable. Because when someone writes a plan and follows it without deviation, emotion becomes secondary. Passion becomes incidental. Relationships become instruments, and Harry realized that despite all the feelings, despite all the shared moments, despite everything he had sacrificed, he had been moving along a path someone else had already mapped. He had entered a marriage not of two equals, but of one active participant and one architect. And now, understanding that, the question became inevitable. What would he do next? He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't reclaim the ignorance of joy, of hope, of love. But he could control the future. And controlling the future meant watching, observing, calculating, timing his next move carefully, because acting impulsively could hand the narrative to someone else entirely. And that's when Harry realized something more terrifying than betrayal. The plan wasn't just about him. It was about him, the world, and the story they would tell together. And without him, if he wasn't careful, the story would continue anyway. Two people said "I do," but what they didn't say out loud, what no one saw, was that the vows were not binding in the same way for both of them. Harry walked down the aisle believing in forever, believing in love that had survived whispers, doubts, and the weight of expectation, believing that marriage would anchor them, fuse them, and create a shared life built on loyalty and trust. He didn't know that, for her, the vows were a milestone, not a foundation. A moment to cement visibility, establish narrative momentum, and maintain the trajectory she and her mother had meticulously planned long before the world applauded. The ceremony itself was magnificent, lavish, polished. Every detail captured the imagination of millions around the globe. The world saw tradition bent to modernity, elegance fused with rebellion, beauty with purpose, a fairy tale unfolding in real time. And Harry believed in that fairy tale. He believed in her. He believed that all the planning, all the optics, all the symbolism were shared gestures of love, not calculated moves in a larger game. But love, as he would come to understand, had already been reframed. The diary revealed it, and the reality he would piece together over the coming weeks made it undeniable. The wedding had sealed not just a union, it had set a trajectory, two trajectories in fact, that diverged in ways he hadn't anticipated. One trajectory was his, rooted in hope, commitment, and shared experience. The other was hers, rooted in timing, independence, and narrative advantage. The conflict between those trajectories was subtle at first, invisible to anyone outside the room. But Harry, intimate with both, began to see it in micro moments. A pause before answering a question, a glance at a family member, not him, a phrase emphasized for public impact, not private truth. Each detail was minor alone. Together, they painted a stark portrait. Harry began to realize that the marriage itself was not the focal point. The public image, the story, the narrative arc was, and he had been cast in it without full knowledge of the role he was playing. He thought of the vows, the promises made in good faith. What made COVID? To love, honor, and support. To stand together in adversity. But the diary suggested those words were aspirational, not binding. Aspirational for him, and that asymmetry cut deeper than betrayal. Because asymmetry isn't always obvious. You can love someone completely and still be walking on a path they've already mapped without you. Harry noticed it in the speeches. The way public attention was subtly directed. The way narrative threads were emphasized. Praise for courage, independence, fortitude. But rarely for partnership. Recognition for resilience, but seldom for compromise. Those elements, when repeated in different contexts, create expectation. They create an image that others, family, media, the public, begin to adopt, and that image reinforces the trajectory. He wondered bitterly how many moments had been staged, or at least guided, for maximum impact, not for intimacy, not for connection, but for perception. And then he remembered the quiet, private moments that felt most real. The laughter shared late at night, the whispered confessions, the vulnerability in darkness. Those moments were real. But real can coexist with planning. Love can be genuine, even when opportunity lurks alongside it. The difference lies in intent. And intent, as he now understood, was the problem. Because the intent behind the diary and the alignment with maternal influence was not about love, it was about leverage, positioning, independence, and timing. Harry had given everything to a marriage he believed would anchor him. The diary suggested that the anchor had never been intended for him. He was expected to move along with the plan, not shape it with equal agency. And that realization brought with it an emotional paradox. He wasn't angry in the conventional sense. He wasn't hurt in the simplistic sense. He was unsettled, disoriented, and grief-stricken by the subtle, quiet, relentless efficiency of it all. The wedding, which should have been